And for not liking extremism came through loud and clear. Doesn't mean you have to like where we are, doesn't mean you have to like where we've been or where we're going, but this is what American democracy feels. This is normal. The rest of the world is the rest of the world. If we really do experience a breakdown in global trade, there are a lot of countries out there that are going to be facing things that are an order of magnitude worse than what we went through with subprime, with the Great Recession. And the challenges to democracy in that environment are, I would argue that the country I am most concerned about is Germany. Because of the Ukraine war, they have lost access to Russian natural gas, which provided them, in terms of their gross consumption, 40% of the total. And even though they've been able to replace the gas, it's an inelastic market, so natural gas prices in Germany are now 6 times what they were before the war. And Germany is not like the United States, where we like to talk a good talk about how we want energy independence, but we really don't care. So we'll take it from Canada or Mexico or Saudi Arabia, we'll make some ourselves. If we don't think anyone's looking, we'll take some from Venezuela. But the Germans can't do that. They're in a more difficult neighborhood, and precision manufacturing requires reliability. So they work with large state-owned companies that export on fixed contracts through fixed infrastructure. And when that broke down, it didn't just interrupt their natural gas supplies. Those natural gas supplies also provide their electricity, and they also provide the inputs for their petrochemical sector. And the petrochemical output is not exported, it's kept in-house to undergird the entire manufacturing sector. So the entire German manufacturing model has basically collapsed. All non-ferrous metal processing has gone away. All fertilizer processing has gone away. We're already seeing automotive down by 1/3 without any change in demand globally. We are probably going to be looking at the end of the German manufacturing model in less than 2 years. What does Germany have going for it if it doesn't have energy, food, or manufacturing? This is a very different world unless you know your German history, in which case this is a very familiar song. And when the Germans feel stressed economically, things spin out of control in a very short period of time, and no one cares who votes for who. So demographics are the study of population structures, and you would normally expect to have more children than teenagers than 20-somethings than 30-somethings and 40-somethings. It tends to be a pyramid just because of mortality. But between industrialization and urbanization, most of the world has turned into a chimney, or even be inverted, so that you've got more people who are in their 40s than children. Russia is a special case even within that, because they had the pogroms, they had the famines, they had the world wars, they had Brezhnev and Khrushchev who shoved everyone into tiny efficiency apartments. And so Russia has the second fastest aging society in the world, and in most parts of the country there are more people in their 60s than there are children. About 1985, the Russian educational system collapsed. And so the youngest people who have kind of the full suite of technical training, who know how to do real work, whether it's accounting or engineering, they're in their late 50s now. So Russia is facing a chronic worker quality issue. It's facing chronic labor shortages. It's seeing a collapse in institutions, including the army. And even within the Kremlin, we are now down to such a small cadre of people that every time that somebody accidentally duct tapes themselves to a long chair and jumps into a pool, it's a national crisis. There is not a lot left to keep this system going, and we're seeing some aspects of that organizational breakdown in the Ukraine war right now.
So let's take that to the Ukraine side. Is that an area where it would help if they took over Ukraine?
Well, technically, if you could absorb Ukraine without a fight and integrate Ukrainians, it would give them another 45 million people overall, but another 10 million young people. That wouldn't hurt. That's not what's happening, though. As soon as the Russians realized on day 4 of the war that this was not going to be a cakewalk, they started dusting off the strategies that they had used in the Chechen war in Grozny and in the Syrian civil war in Aleppo. And they're going with a complete civilian obliteration effort now, leveling every individual population center they come across. Obviously, you're seeing this in places like Mariupol and Krakow and Kiev, but those are the big cities, so that's where we're seeing the most news. But any area that they have taken over, they have already just completely razed any of the small towns and villages that they've come across. So this is the war now is designed to generate as many possible refugees as possible, because refugees leave, and then reduce everything else to rubble, and anyone who's left behind is a guerrilla fighter, and you can shoot them on sight.
what are we seeing as the most likely outcome from this point going forward?
Oh, the Russians are definitely going to win the war. The question is how many Ukrainians die between now and then and how long it takes. The big concern in the Western world now is that we have been disabused of any notions that the Russian military is a pure force to NATO. And we now know that if American forces come head-to-head with Russian forces, that the Russian force would be obliterated. That sounds like good news from a defense point of view, but it's actually really bad from a strategic point of view, because if we do have a direct NATO-Russia fight, and the Russian forces are just embarrassingly wiped out, the Russian government will have a simple choice to make. Complete strategic humiliating withdrawal, or up the ante to nukes. So NATO policy now is to shove as many weapon systems as we possibly can into the Ukrainian space to keep the Ukrainians going as long and as hard as possible, make this war as bloody as possible for the Russians, and turn the entire country of Ukraine into an imperial kill zone so that this is the last war that Russia can fight, and it can never move beyond Ukraine. That's now the strategy on both sides, is to devastate this area as much as we can. The Russians, when it became clear that Ukraine was not just going to be handed to them, what the Russians are up to is they're trying to get to the gateway territories that allow physical access for other countries to invade them. So the Russians have been invaded like 50 times through their history, and it's always been through one of 9 gateway territories. The ones that are relevant to this conversation are the Bessarabian Gap, which goes into Romania, the Polish Gap, which obviously goes into Poland, and the Baltic Sea coast, which includes the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Ukraine is nothing more to the Russians than on the way to those gateways that they need to plug. So this is not a one-stop shop war. This is simply kind of a middle of the ground, because they've already plugged some in the Caucasus, they've already plugged one in Kazakhstan. They now have to move forward to plug these 3 on their western edge, and they're not going to stop until they get there. The question is whether or not they can get there. And that's one of the reasons why NATO is so focused now on keeping the war in Ukraine, so we don't have a direct NATO-Russia clash. Well, this is a country of 45 million people, and probably within 48 hours, the number of refugees that have fled will hit 3 million, which is already the single fastest, largest population movement in human history. Within 3 months, that number will probably hit 10 million. And the populations that are fleeing are heavily concentrated in women under 40 and children. So from a completely amoral, neutral economic point of view, if you're a country in Europe and you've got a terminal demography and your birth rate has been low for decades, this is a shot in the arm. Because here is a population coming in that knows they're going to need to start over. Most of them know that they can't go back because the Russians are destroying everything, and they need to start from scratch. But they're also probably the best educated refugee community we have ever seen. And so, assuming a country can integrate them, looking at you, Canada, the ability to round out your demographic profile and have workers and consumers in the future, long-term investment here, of course, is a pretty smart move. I would anticipate, since there's a lot of sympathy across the West, that most countries are going to put together some sort of refugee visa program for these people. But just to give you an idea of the scale, you remember back a few years ago when the Syrian refugees came into Germany, and over the course of a year and a half, it just upended German and European politics. Poland in the last 3 weeks has already accepted more refugees from Ukraine than the entirety of the Syrian flow to all of the European Union for a year and a half. Just the scale of this is utterly unprecedented.
Did mention a hint to Canadians. One thing that we did during this pandemic was actually see a larger amount of immigration come into this country. That's one of the strategies that we've been hearing from economists, that it could really help with growth in this country because we have a low birth rate as well. Do you think there should be a more aggressive viewpoint from the federal government in Canada to say, those from Ukraine, refugees, open our doors, let's bring them all in as much as we can to help not only them, but also the Canadian economy and society as well?
I'd argue the Canadian government's been doing that for about 30 years. Because the birth rate has been so low in Canada for so long, you're kind of on an immigration treadmill. And as long as you keep the doors open and people keep coming in, you put off the day where you face a kind of a demographic collapse situation like we're seeing in Japan and China and Russia and a lot of Europe. So despite the fact that the average age in Canada is so high and there are so few children, you keep bringing in people in their 20s and 30s. As long as that continues, the financial calamities that a lot of the world is facing will pass you by. And Canada is the only country culturally that has been able to pull this off to this scale so far. As long as you keep doing it, you'll be in good shape.